afternoon to a webinar from the Addiction Prevention Coalition. My name is Art Wimberly. I'm a volunteer with APC, and I'm a person grateful to be in long-term recovery. Today, we're going to have special guests with us, Pam and Steve Moore, authors of a new book called Natural Pathways of Recovery, using the STAR Matrix assessment and MMRP to revolutionize treatment. Steve is online with us already. His wife, Pam, will be joining us momentarily. She's actually finishing up a session. In the meantime, I want to go ahead and introduce to you Steve Moore. Steve is already on screen for us. Steve is almost needs no introduction, really, I think, around Central Alabama. Steve is a person in long-term recovery, but also a licensed therapist with Moore Institute, but also a founder of the Addiction Research Foundation here in Birmingham as well. Hey, Steve, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Art, I'm glad to be here.
Thanks. And I know Pam will be with us in just a moment, and we'll introduce her also. But the purpose of today's webinar is to let people know about this book that we just talked about, Natural Pathways of Recovery. And Steve, am I correct in that y'all's daughter did the original artwork?
She did. That's actually from a painting that's hanging in our waiting room right now that she did for Father's Day for me last year. So there's actually a very large painting in our waiting room, and that's a sample of that, my daughter's first cover art.
Wow, it's very impressive. I think she's very creative.
Well, thank you.
As I said, the main reason for the webinar today is to get Pam and Steve on and talk about this book, what they were trying to convey in it and why they wrote it now. Anytime I see a title that says something like revolutionize, my antenna go up. So talk to us a little bit, Steve, about what you mean by using the term revolutionized treatment in the book.
Well, we think that we've been burdened for a good while with a fairly limited notion of both the problem and the solution, and that broadening of that truly could revolutionize treatment and truly could give us a chance to be more helpful, which is the whole reason that we wrote the book, is that we would like to be able to be more helpful to more people. Right. So I think Pam's decided to join me here.
Here she is. Yay.
Have a link.
Okay. There we go. Pam Moore.
Pam Moore, everybody. Pam, I got to ask you a question, because I know you are already a published author prior to this book. I think you did The Kingdom Within and Unhook and Live Free and the workbook that went with that, right? So why?
And Show Me the Way.
Show You the Way. That's right. There were 3 of them. So, but I got to figure out, why in the world would you let Steve actually become a co-author?
But I think she just decided to throw me a bone on it.
Yeah, because I noticed you never would put him on the other ones. And
well, that's really because I didn't help her at all on the other books that I read through. But I have to admit now, some of the words in here I actually wrote, Art.
Okay, all right, excellent. Well, Pam, we were just getting started on why you guys wrote Natural Pathways of Recovery. Now, I want to clarify something, because it says natural. I don't think, based on my reading of the book, you just mean natural like holistic or whatever, although it could include that. Tell us what you actually mean by that.
Well, really what we meant was that there is a history, there's a recovery that's going to be natural to the individual. Okay. So probably unique, individualized, actually having to do with what's going to work best in a natural way for the person. You're absolutely right, and we thought pretty hard about the title, as you might imagine, but it's not intended necessarily to be all natural in the way that we talk about fruits and vegetables, but more that there is a unique, special, and natural pathway for each person.
Okay, great. I think that really helps folks that would consider getting the book to understand that. One of the things you guys say in the introduction and that I've heard you say before in many different ways, is that most people get better. They just don't get better in the ways that we thought that they should get better. Is that right? So was that part of the impetus for actually writing the book?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. We, as we were looking around, we saw very much a pass-fail system that didn't seem to be that seemed to be unsuccessful, or at least appear to be unsuccessful for a lot of people. And so, more than anything else, we wanted to take a look and say, well, what's really happening with most of the people out there? We knew that that the model that we had been taught early on probably, at least it was incomplete. The information in it was incomplete. And so we very much wanted to know what do people in the real world with more than 10 years of sobriety, more than 20 years of sobriety, what do they actually look like, and how did they get there? And to us, that seemed like a good approach.
So
there's also this part too, or like I just saw this woman that I, have seen off and on for 20 years. And in this 20 years, she probably has 19 years of sobriety with like relapses off and on, that would probably equal out to about a year. Yeah. Is that success or is that failure?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because as Steve said, we often try to judge it either from the inside, from the professional angle, or from the outside as family members as pass fail. And if there's a relapse, it's kind of like there's a failure. It's just all failure. Yeah. So question is, the Addiction Research Foundation, was it kind of born out of this observation that y'all were making in y'all's first few years or decade or two decades of counseling and therapy and working in recovery treatment? Was the foundation born out of what you were observing?
Very much so. It was born out of a frustration. That just like you, we very much have a heart for helping people get better. It's where we live and breathe. And so it was born out of a frustration that what we knew is that we were sort of only a few people seemed to be getting better. And then we'd have all of these people that seemed to not be getting better, or that we were losing track of, along the way. And it was very frustrating for us. You have to like start thinking of yourself as the kind of person who's okay with a 10% success rate. And we were not okay with that. Yeah. And just still are not. As we've said many times, we have to do better. We have to do better. Art, I know you've heard me say before, our business, what we do for a living, is the only one where we never lose. Because if the person gets better, we say, isn't the program great?
Yep.
But if the person doesn't get better, we say, well, they hadn't hit bottom, or they were non-compliant.
Right, or they just didn't work it. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that to us, we couldn't live with what obviously seemed untrue. We can tell going back, we were actually watching some video of things we had talked about 15 years ago. And we can actually see that we were really beginning to struggle, with the recovery models, and beginning to struggle with what was frankly seemed like a lack of success, and know that we had to find ways to do better, even if it meant giving up some of our cherished notions.
Right. Which is a big deal in recovery, right?
Which is a big deal in recovery.
Yeah. We have to work our own recovery, even as treatment helpers or allies, right?
Yes,
right.
We do.
So Addiction Research Foundation was formed. You spent a lot of money and time trying to gather data. That was frustrating. You talk about that in the book. And there was an interesting kind of little occurrence, maybe that was unexpected. I believe this is true. You got more information off of kind of the social media follow-up thing than you did this really expensive survey that had been sent out. And tell us the reason for that. Why did you get more response from that, do you think, than from the more formal research?
Well, we've got a bunch of ideas about that we don't know for sure. One was that the biggest part of the first survey, we may have aligned ourselves too closely with a treatment center. And so we, as we tried to contact people afterwards, they may have felt like the treatment center was trying to contact them. And even though we had gone to great pains to try to separate ourselves from that, I don't think we ever really did. Because the initial data collection took place inside an inpatient treatment facility. So we wonder if there was too close an association, whereas the surveys that we can do online have anonymity and no connection with any treatment center at all.
Okay.
And so we think maybe that's why we ended up getting better information. You know, we've got a couple of other ideas about things that we've changed around that we think may have affected it, but that's what we've come down to.
I think too, like with the treatment center, you know, and with the traditional approach, no matter what, when you try to talk to someone and say, the treatment program teaches the 12 steps and this person's not going to the 12 steps and not drinking either, they feel very defensive about it. You know, they feel like they're going to be shamed. And so, and I think that just bled over too.
That makes sense. That makes it. We've all got biases. Some of them we know, some of them we don't know, and it occurs in both directions. So that makes
sense.
Yeah. All right. So there's so much I want to talk about in the book. I want y'all to talk about the multimodal recovery process as a framework. And then we want to get into STAR Matrix as kind of that really in-depth tool that does assessment. There's a quote, and this may be kind of the central thing out of the whole book. It says, true agreement may be the most important aspect of treatment. Yeah. True agreement may be the most. Tell us what you're talking about there.
Well, what we think is happening is a thing called cheap agreement. And that is, are you an addict or are you an alcoholic? And most people, by the time they come in contact with somebody like us, have heard that word. And because they know that there's something going on, they might even agree. They might say, yeah, I think I am an alcoholic. And at that moment, what we think is we suddenly understand each other. We suddenly understand what's going on with the person, and we move toward the solution. Okay, you're going to need to commit to abstinence. You're going to need to go and do these meetings. So we skip from that cheap agreement straight into planning about what to do. And so what we think is that agreement is not real. You know, and we began to see it more and more over time, where when we would ask people, what do you really mean about that? Or what do you really think is going on with you? We would realize that we were using the word correctly in a sentence. I'm an alcoholic. Yes, I'm an alcoholic too. And assume that we both meant the same thing, and we don't.
Yeah.
We don't mean the same things at all about that word.
Right. I think y'all even wrote this idea that you could then get false compliance without real agreement. And
absolutely.
People may wonder, well, aren't we just talking about semantics? But we're really not.
No.
Go ahead, Pam.
I was going to say, like, I can't even tell you, like, over the last 25 years, how many times a person like has been in treatment and, you know, said, yes, I'm an alcoholic in treatment. The treatment program thought that they were all in agreement. And the first thing they say when they would walk in my office is, I'm glad I'm out of there because I don't really think I'm an alcoholic, but I had to say that to get out.
Or I think depression's really my issue, or I think anxiety is really more of my problem, or I think this other thing. And so more than once, we realized that what we were doing was buying this cheap agreement and then moving straight to compliance.
Yeah.
Which, gosh, if you want to get out of a treatment center, you're going to call yourself an alcoholic and go to some meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. You could be compliant for 28 days.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe even get sobriety. And what the big book of AA would say, then we just become a more clever version of our old self, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I want to, in the book, you guys framed it in the beginning by telling each of your stories, okay? In a lot of detail, okay? I want to use that as a way of moving into the chapter called RAW, which is an acronym for RAW, for ready, able, willing, right? Because I think that comes in line with what we're talking about compliance and agreement. They're two different things. Pam, if you don't mind, you were pretty brave to tell the story. I know you've done it before, but I think it serves as an example in a sense of where somebody might be ready, they might even be willing, but there may not be much ability to get better. Could you share a little bit about that from your own story?
Well, with my story, I'm not sure. I was ready to feel better, to be honest, and I always try to be really honest about my story. I was ready to feel better. I thought I had a bad problem. I was homeless. Of course, I had a problem. And I was willing to go to treatment. One part of my able was about being, I was homeless.
Right. Didn't have very many resources.
I did not have any resources. And it's interesting to me because so I didn't have a treatment program to go to, and I started going to 12-step meetings. And the people in the meetings helped me find a state-funded program to go to. And so they ended up becoming my resource to help me. And really, what they told me, and I appreciate this, and I even think it's really rare, but what they told me, because I'd been going to meetings for a month before I went to treatment, which is unusual too. But what they told me is that, you just need more than this, that, and they were very honest with me. You're not going to stay sober just coming to meetings. It's not going to happen. And they told me the truth. We think you're sicker than most people who walk in the door. And I was.
Yeah.
I was physically sicker and emotionally sicker and spiritually sicker than, most people. They saw me when I walked in the door. I weighed 85 pounds. I had 2 black eyes. Like I said, I was homeless. I'd been, this is crazy, but this is the truth. And I had just days before fought wild dogs for some baloney.
Yeah.
And it was a place that most people don't go that far down.
Right.
So I had a lot further up to come than like Steve did. And so if you looked at the star matrix thing, I was consequence wise and all that was going on in my life. I was a much more severe than Steve.
Yeah. Each of those 5 factors, we'll talk about in a minute on star matrix. You were way out you weren't near the center very much. You were.
And anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I hope anybody listening to this now or in the future will understand, no matter how far down that levels we go, there's hope. And both of y'all are living representations of that. But for your story, if people will get the book and read it and others already know it, the scales for you were off the scale. You were off the charts.
Yes.
On so many different things. Yet for the last 30 years or so or more, I think you just hit 34 years, I believe, right?
I did.
Congratulations. You have not only survived, you've been thriving and been helping other people find hope and come to that same conclusion. So there's probably a lot of folks that would heard your story prior to getting sober and said there's no hope. And they may be facing that with their loved one right now in some form.
Yeah, and actually people said that to me directly, that they thought I was hopeless. And actually even 2 of the counselors in my treatment program told me they told me there was no way I could make it. And I always tell people the sad part is I agreed with them and didn't think I really would either. And when I first got sober, I really believed that I was going to be one of those that was a chronic relapser and never be able to really find true sobriety. So it didn't even hurt my feelings when they said that to me.
Yeah,
It's like, yeah, I mean, obviously.
I already knew that, right? Yeah.
That's right.
Well, that reminds me of something else that was interesting in your story. You admitted that when you first went to treatment and even the first year or two, you had not already decided that you weren't going to use some. In fact, I think you had said, well, I'm going to at least hold on to one of them. And it was 2 years in sober before I think you even came to the conclusion, I might not have to use for the rest of my life.
That's right. I actually had pot as my backup plan.
Yeah.
That I knew I couldn't drink. I knew I was definitely an alcoholic. And I knew I'd been doing crystal meth. And so I knew I couldn't do any of that. But I had it in my head that probably I would be able to smoke pot successfully. I don't even know why I didn't even like pot, but another sort. And so really for me, it was like a gradual, and one of my favorite AA slogans actually is I came to believe.
Yeah.
And I believe that is my story because it took me a long time to really commit with all my heart to sobriety. One, because the thing with getting sober is you both have to have the confidence that you can and the ability. And what I was lacking was the confidence that I could. And I didn't believe I could. And most of the people around me didn't believe I could either, even the helping professionals. And I was blessed with a really good counselor, that I had here in Birmingham when I got sober, Tony Morris.
Shout out to Tony.
Shout out to Tony,
Yeah.
Who I'm still in contact with today. He's a really good man and a really good advocate for sobriety. And he was probably the only person, that believed I could, and really stuck with me. And one thing I want to say is how important that is, to have at least that one person to believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself.
Yeah. It's we say you're really borrowing somebody else's hope for a while till you get your own, which again is step two. I came to believe process over time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So 2 years sober, then you go, oh, I may could actually do this the rest of my life with all things. And the reason I bring that up is I think it's important because as a recovering person myself, but also as a family member with loved ones and struggling mightily from substance use disorder, one of the things I had to learn was the whole reason you're writing this book is everybody's pathway is not going to look the same.
Right.
And it's startling, I think, to us family members, even if we've gone through recovery, to sometimes realize my son or daughter or wife or loved one or whoever it is theirs is just not going to look like there's not some textbook way it all has to look.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's so important, Art, because like what you're saying about Pam's story is for the first few years there, she wasn't committed.
Yeah.
You don't get to say that sort of thing out loud, but for the first few years, I'm thinking I still might like to smoke pot.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very common thing, but she was still in the process of getting ready. She was still in the process. And what we've got to do is support people while they are transitioning, while they are getting better. We have to find ways to facilitate what's really happening with them instead of try to shoehorn them into total acceptance in your heart that you're an addict, absolute commitment, as if that's the only possible pathway. It's not even realistic.
Yeah.
And certainly Pam's life and Pam's, all of us would agree that it's been spectacular in terms of recovery, in terms of abstinence. But as you and I mentioned before, that's an unusual outcome.
Yeah.
It's unusual for some, Pam and I are sort of outliers in the statistics.
That's one of the points y'all make when you each tell your story in the book is that you're kind of the anti-examples.
We are.
Of how
we are. Our stories in many ways, are examples, but the reality is that most people don't just hit a bottom. realize they're an addict, get into recovery, work it, and then stay clean for the rest of their lives. That's just an unusual outcome. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people aren't still getting better.
That's right. Progress without perfection.
Yes, yes.
One of the things we are trying as family members, we're trying to educate ourselves, even like tonight, we'll do the parents of addicted loved ones, which is not just parents, it's all loved ones could come. But that's one of the things we're trying to do is educate ourselves about the fact that our loved ones' recovery may look very different from what we've been told it should look like.
Right.
And one of the reasons that's important for people like me is it keeps my ability to hope can stay more solid, not just based on what I was told has to happen. So that's why I think a book like this is important. All right, so let's go back to Raw, because I want y'all to talk more about the RAW and kind of the interaction there and why you thought that, because that's kind of like the segue, that's the shift in the book, really. You get there, and then we start talking about the solution with MMRP and Star Matrix, which we'll cover in a minute. So talk about Raw.
You know, for years, we were doing a kind of therapy in individual work that we started informally calling Get Ready. You know, we would have people who came in the door who we could tell they had a substance use disorder. We could tell that they have the thing that we traditionally call alcoholism and drug addiction. Probably other people could tell. There used to be an old saying that even a 5-year-old can tell when you have a problem with alcohol, you know, but that doesn't mean that the person is ready. That doesn't mean that they're ready. And so what we started doing is saying, well, what are the factors? You know, what are the factors? What does it take to get ready? You know, what do I have to realize, know, and understand in order to be ready, you know, for actual change? And, you know, and there's been a lot of models that the motivational interviewing and other change models that have been sort of an attempt to apply to this, you know, to this idea. And of course, we were informed by all of that, you know, all of that we had, you know, read about and understood. But really what we wanted to do is know for sure whether or not a person was at a point where they were actually ready to make any sort of change that would actually be helpful. Because otherwise, just knowing that they needed help forced us to try to cause them to get help before they were ready.
Yeah. Kind of like they're only in pre-contemplation. Yeah. Kind of like in that model. Yeah. And we're
Exactly.
trying to, yeah. Yeah. And as loved ones or helpers, if we're kind of off on that stage, then our help may be more hurtful than it is helpful. Is that right?
That's very true. And we used to see that more than once, that folks who, you know, we can see that there needs to be some sort of intervention here because we want to protect our loved one from future negative consequences. But what it causes us to do is force them into, and that's not willingness. Leverage is not willingness. Force them into some sort of a treatment, you know, process that really is likely to do more harm than good. And what it definitely does is taints the future. You know, in other words, we run into a lot of people who were forced to go into treatment in high school or, you know, late adolescence or something like that, and they really didn't think they needed to be there. And what it did is sort of tainted the experience of therapy, tainted the experience of treatment, tainted the meetings. You know, it just gave them a bad taste in their mouth. So now later on, when they need it, it makes them less likely to be attracted to it.
That makes sense. Now, I want to stop there and pause for just a second because I think I want you to say something that you're not saying right there. Often when we make an important point, we got to go back and say, let me tell you what I did not just say. You're not saying when a 17 or 18-year-old in somebody's home is struggling, but they don't think they need treatment. You're not saying that as family members, we need to be in agreement with their use, right?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, we need to be finding ways to support and facilitate what their pathway of recovery is actually going to be. What's getting better going to look like for them. You know, and we're going to need help and support for that. We're going to need a lot greater and more nuanced understanding and approach to what is going on with people. But I'm certainly not saying that parents have got to be okay with their kids' misuse or ingestion of mood-altering substance, when clearly it's maladaptive, dysfunctional, and not good for them.
Yeah, so there's a difference between understanding it's a process that doesn't mean you don't set boundaries, because, the boundaries are about what I'm going to do and what I'm going to
Yes.
be able to live with. And if, and as a parent of a 16 or 17-year-old, there's, that's pretty much all you're doing is setting boundaries anyway.
Right.
But
which is one of the most overused terms, and the hardest to do is to actually know how to set and hold a boundary. Because as you said, it's not what I'm expecting you to do. It's what I'm no longer going to do or allow. If you just step to come across that, that's your choice, not mine. And that's different.
And Art, you know as well as anybody that what most of us do is want to make the choice that we do not have.
Yes.
To get better. That's what the choice we all want to make.
Yeah. So with raw, you had a quote in the book. I think it said something like, without a sufficient quantity of ready, able, and willing, it's very difficult for anybody to get much better.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will tell you that for me, is that even though I wasn't sure I was an addict when I really was ready, willing, and able to do a lot of hard work, while still being unsure if this was truly addiction. And that to me is like why I did not relapse, was the ready, willing, and able to be extraordinarily uncomfortable in life. And working towards recovery while really wondering, am I really an addict, or is this, because of childhood trauma, or is this because of depression, or this or that, and I'm glad that I inadvertently gave myself the time to really wonder about that, instead of trying to make myself go by the rules, of you got to admit it. And what I tell people all the time is that it's okay to be in doubt about being an addict or not, but really to not use while you're figuring it out is a better plan.
Absolutely.
Great. That's a great way to look at it. In fact, we had one of our 5 children that struggled. We had 3 children that struggled significantly. One came to that same conclusion after a lot of therapeutic work. They eased him into the fact that, well, maybe it would be okay not to use while I'm working some of this out. And that sounds insane to yeah, duh. But when you're talking with that magical world of addiction, this thinking is not very straight most of the time. So
that's right.
Yeah. All right. So finish us up on raw. Give us one last word or two on raw, because it really, to me in the book, that was kind of the place where, okay, now we're going with different solutions.
Well, it's not that you have to have an actual equal amount of each of those factors. However, any one can sabotage the ability to get better. So if I don't have at least some readiness, there's no matter how much ability or willingness, right? And if I don't have some willingness, there's no matter how much, readiness and ability. So each of these factors are related to the other. But what we were trying to say is that without a sufficient amount of each, it's very difficult to get better. What that really means, if any one of them is 0,
yeah,
and that's a lot of what we assess for, is any one of these things 0, then it's going to be hard. We're going to have to figure out how to change that number.
Okay, so for instance, if I came in, you did an assessment and you said, well, Art's ready and he's willing, but gosh, he doesn't have any resources.
Right.
That's one you're going to try to kind of spend the attention to. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And that happens. This person, doesn't have a job, has kids at home, has whatever, no insurance. And, all of a sudden, they're ready to change and they're actually willing to change, but their ability is very, very limited. Well, of course, that's the factor we've got to work on.
Yeah.
But it's going to be difficult to get better, but that's the factor that we've got to work on. What we see more often is that people who have ability, but they don't have very much willingness. What Pam had was a ton of willingness to be uncomfortable and to work really hard. So ready, willing, and able, ready, able, and willing is the thing we changed it to so we could get raw.
Yeah, I love that. I love acrostics. So I'm willing to contort anything to make an acrostic, even if it doesn't make sense. There's something about memory that grabs those things. I still remember the very first lesson in recovery on denial, and they had an acrostic with the D, the E, the N. I could still quote it 20 years later. I'm not sure I'm doing it well, but I can still quote it. All right. So all that research, and then all of the work and the idea about ready, able, willing, then eventually over time, y'all began developing the multimodal recovery process. Okay, so tell us, frame that for us, and then let's move into the tool of the STAR matrix.
Okay. So what we did is a multimodal recovery process, of course, just means that there's more than one way at looking at the problem. So there's multiple ways, multiple modes to look at what is going on with people, even the things that we broadly call substance use disorder. There's more than one way to look at and think about and characterize that. And then the multimodal recovery is that there's more than one way to get better. In fact, there's as many ways to get better really as there are people who do get better. There are many ways. So that's the multi part.
So would it be accurate to say the MMRP is kind of like the philosophy, the big philosophy about problem and solution? Multiple. Okay, so you kind of hang everything in that philosophy.
We hang everything in that philosophy. From that came the thing that we called PAPA, which is that we changed we gave up the word addiction and alcoholism, although we still use all of that language in our work and it's in the book. What we decided is let's just back up and call it problem. That's the P. You know, everybody that comes to see us knows that something is wrong. Let's not label it until we've talked about it.
Okay.
Until we really understand everything that you think is going on with you. What do you think is happening here? What do you think is happening? And we don't let people just say, well, I'm an alcoholic. We say, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
You know, exactly what do you mean by that? And so what we want to do is really understand the problem. Then the second part that you've already mentioned, the A, is agreement, right? And until we agree with you and you agree with us about the exact nature of the problem, we don't move to the second P, which is plan. Now that we've got this agreement, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to work with this? Now, I want to mention too, Art, that it's not that we don't do containment right up front. If somebody's drinking too much or whatever, we do containment. But then the last A is accountability and adjustment. So how am I going to know that my plan is working or not working well before something awful happens? You know,
you even have fittingly the quote from Coach K at Duke in his last year, by the way, right? And I think you quoted him saying, "I got a plan, but the whole game is about adjustments."
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Constant adjustments, as a matter of fact. Nobody that I know who's in long-term recovery is still working exactly the same program that they worked at the beginning.
Right.
I mean, everybody.
Sorry, go ahead.
You adjust, you change, you move. More things come up, more things come along. And so, of course, your plan is constantly changing. I wonder why we don't see that from the beginning.
That's a good point, because by the time you get to the end of your book, each of you then retell your story in terms of how your recovery has changed to fit the seasons of your life or the needs or even the maturity levels and transfer. Pam talks about going deeper, right? Maybe I don't attend 12-step as my primary, but the things I got from that have carried me forward, and I'm doing different things now because I'm growing and my needs are different to grow, not just stay sober, but to actually mature. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely true. You're characterizing it just right. That's just what we're thinking.
Yeah, at 34 years sober, you don't, crave a drink every day.
Yeah.
And really the truth is that 12-step programs have often been called spiritual kindergarten, and yet there's no matriculation plan. There's no way to move on.
Yeah.
And we're not saying that people shouldn't stay in the 12-step programs and help others and mentor and sponsor and grow folks. And a lot of people have a strong heart for that and are doing great work, and we're glad for it. We're glad for it. But all of those people that I've ever talked to also have grown in other ways spiritually.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Rarely would you find a mature addict or alcoholic that's done 12-step work that hasn't found other ways to grow, for sure. Yeah.
Right.
And it just may be that their give back is primarily within the rooms or within the communities of 12-step. I do a podcast, and you guys may know Brent Bottom. Brent came on the other day, and he gives us permission to use his name. But it was interesting to listen to his story, kind of like what y'all were talking about. It was not predictable the way things happen for him to get better. But
Yeah.
one of the things, he is a primary mover and shaker in the 12-step community, right? But even he would talk about the fact that there are other dynamics that are helping him grow. It's just his give back is primarily in those rooms and with those organizations. Okay.
Right. And thank God for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're super grateful.
Yep. Okay, so from multimodal recovery process, which, as you said, both gives you lots of ways of looking at the problem and thus lots of ways of looking at the possible solutions, then out of that over time developed the STAR matrix system. Okay, so you're gonna, it's a 5-pointed star, right? So you're going to talk about a lot of things that always have been talked about in recovery, genetics, or is it biology, you know, that type of thing. But tell us about what the 5 points represent and a little bit about the scales. We talked about, Pam was way out of the way from the center on the scale. Talk about that.
Well, so the way that the star matrix works is 0 is the center of the star. And then in each arm of the star, intensity increases as you go out the arm. So that's the 0 is in the center, and each of the 5 arms of the star has a scale going up to 10 that indicates intensity. And across the vertical axis, the straight line that's usually across the middle of the page, what we're measuring there is the thing that would usually be called the thing itself: addiction, alcoholism, substance use disorder, and the intensity of it. So know that what we're trying to measure on this, Art, is the answer to the question. People say, well, is it a disease or not? Yes. Is it a result of using too much or not? Yes. Is it a result of trauma or other underlying issues and associated? Yes. You know, the answer is yes to all of those, because when we say that this thing is complex, probably genetic, biopsychosocial, with a complex and multifactorial etiology, we mean that. Right. We mean that. But what we boiled it down to is just saying, like, are you an addict or not? Yeah. And so what we're measuring here is the genetic predisposition, how much the biology is a factor, how much the frequency, intensity, and duration of your using is a factor. That is, how much and how many things you used for how long. And that's how we get that middle line in the star, which is trying to understand, like if you had started very young, had a lot of it in your family history, there's a clear abnormal response to using, you know, we might scale you out pretty high on the thing that we call genetics and biology. And if you were using like a very addicting substance like methamphetamine or heroin or something like that for years and years, very consistently, that's a high frequency, intensity, and duration. So that person's going to be a 9 and a 9. They're going to have a very broad look there. Yeah. Whereas another person might have none of that really in their family history and have started later in life, but they've been doing some drugs that pretty intensely for a few years. We would still call them a meth addict, right? They would get the same diagnosis, but their intensity is actually different. Yeah, it is a different intensity of having the very same thing. Then on the other scales, what we're trying to measure is other associated or unassociated mental health issues like anxiety, depression, all the other things, PTSD.
Yeah. What are typically grouped under coexisting disorders, perhaps?
Exactly. Exactly. Comorbidity, as they say, coexisting disorders. And we're doing that without regard to whether or not it pre-existed the using, yeah, or came after the using. Yeah. We're not asking chicken and egg question there. We're just saying this is a factor now.
Yes, that's good. That's good.
Right. And then there's another arm for physical issues. That's physical pain, age, chronic conditions. All of those things can very much be a factor. And again, that's without regard to whether or not they pre-existed or were caused by. Yeah. Many of us have damaged our bodies because of using, right? And then the other arm, which is the trickiest, is the one that's broadly called consequences or traumas.
Right. Now, wasn't it within that point that over time you guys began to see that shame was such a huge factor that you kind of drew it out and began paying more attention to it? Would that be accurate?
That's very true.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true. What we began to see was that it's not necessarily, as you well know, are the things that happened to me, had they happened to you, might not affect you the same way.
Yeah.
So that makes it very difficult to be objective about, like, if I got hit with a bat, you got hit with a bat, would we be affected the same way a year later?
Yeah.
And that, of course, the answer is no. And so we started looking at shame, as how much it causes me to feel bad about myself now.
Yeah, the level of distress could be totally different from the same event for you or I or Pam.
Right.
Absolutely, and it is.
Yeah.
The same thing could happen to all. And I think that one of the things we saw is everybody wanted it to be the same no matter who you were. It's not. And so a lot of times something that would sound like not that big of a deal to one person, it's a huge thing. And then something that sounds ginormous, like, oh my God, it really has not affected that person's life that much.
And shame then, Art, is a good way to measure the intensity with which it negatively affects my sense of self today. One of the things we say is that I won't drink and use over what I did in the past or what was done to me in the past. I will over how I feel about it today.
Yeah, that's so important. Yeah. I think it hit home with me about probably close to 20 years ago. I heard the wife of John Baker, who started Celebrate Recovery, his wife was sharing her story, and she talked about her childhood growing up. She had a brother, and she said they were in a family that moved every other year. And for some reason, her personality was able to make friends the first day at school, but she watched her brother struggle and stumble and go downhill quickly through no fault of his own. But I think it's that same thing we're talking about. Different personalities will take on different traumas in much different ways. Whereas one may just roll right off the back, the other, it really sticks with them. And that has that's not been taken into account, I think, until more recently.
Yeah, I really agree with that. But because it's such a big factor, we have to have better and better ways to assess for it. How is it affecting that raw factor? And how is it affecting our plan in the future? We've really got to have better ways to assess for and address that as part of our plan. And we think that's a big reason for our increase in success is as we get better and better at doing that.
That's great. I wish there's so much more I want to talk about. We probably have to do this again. But before we close, I want to ask you this. Who was this book for? Who did you write?
Well, we really want to change the way that those of us in the helping profession approach this. But we wanted to write it so that it would be accessible for everyone. So I think at the beginning of this, we said, if you or a loved one is suffering, it can be very scary. And we think this book can help. We think if you or a loved one are suffering, but we also think that for the treatment professional or for the person who's trying to figure out a better way, because all of us want to help more people. All of us are trying to figure out a better way. So we think it's written for both, and we hope it's accessible to both. That was our idea.
Yeah, I think it is. I actually think it's accessible to the helpers, the professionals or informal helpers, family members, allies, loved ones, and I think even for the struggling, somebody who may be struggling with substance use disorder, trying to find a way to. So I highly recommend it to anybody. I love the appendix in the back that has a list of resources, has a way to look at an adverse childhood experience test, that type of thing too. So how would people get the book?
So it's available on Amazon. So you can get a Kindle copy, you can get a hard copy available on Amazon. You can also, I think Barnes and Noble has it as well.
And you can order it from our website.
And you can order it from our website. So which we can put in the chat as we're going off is moreinstitute.net or addictionresearchfoundation.org. So moreinstitute.net or addictionresearchfoundation.org, either way, or come see us. You know, Art, as you know, this book is for everyone and all proceeds go to the Addiction Research Foundation.
Yeah, which just pours more assets back into what you've been exploring. And I know your heart is, yes, it'd be great if folks locally use you for this, and that's what you're there for. But I know that you're trying to expand this fruit out as far as you can possibly do it for those that need help or are helpers.
Yes, sir.
And again, I just want to thank you guys for your heart, your giving of your resources. That I've told people before, we mentioned it before you came on air. I mean, tonight's an example. We'll have a parents of addicted loved ones, which is any family member or any person who's concerned can come to support there. But that's just one of a number of support resources and prevention resources that you guys give so generously there at your building. So we want to thank you again for that. As I close, let me mention one thing in general to the folks out there too. APC, Addiction Prevention Coalition, has a couple of things coming up. One is next Friday, a week from tomorrow. There's a pop-up resource addiction event in 5 Points South, right near the fountain. It's free. There's going to be resources on addiction, on grief with addiction. There will be folks there with HIV screening if you want it, for COVID, and even some vaccine information for COVID, as well as a free lunch. So we will invite the whole public, helpers, anybody that's interested out there next week. And if you'll look at the apcbham.org website, there are other things that you can either attend, get educated about, or be a part of. But again, Steve and Pam, thank you so much. I recommend the book to anybody out there. It's a very usable resource. Guys, thank you again. Love you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Art.
And Art, we really appreciate all the work that Addiction Prevention Coalition is doing, and it's really been amazing under your and Carrie's.
Yeah, it really has been, Art. We appreciate you guys very much and appreciate
I'm a volunteer. They do all the work.
Well, your wife is amazing.
Yes, I agree. My only spiritual gift is talking. So thank y'all for talking with me. See you. Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Folks, see you next time.